Welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to discuss the process of digestion, but I want to start out by giving you an example that maybe you've experienced yourself. Have you ever been on pain medication, narcotics after surgery, and had the untoward consequence of constipation? Well, this process of digestion, simply stated, takes the food that we eat and makes it available to our bodies for the energy and the nutrients that we need. It goes unnoticed and often underappreciated unless there's a digestive disorder. So that pain medication causing constipation is just one example of what happens when there's an alteration in the process of digestion. Most Americans have had a digestive disorder sometime during their lives, and according to the National Institutes of Health, between 60 and 70 million Americans are affected by digestive diseases. Probably the two most common are constipation and diarrhea. So this lecture is going to focus on the basic functions of the gastrointestinal tract, taking us from beginning to end, some of the common ailments, and some of the dietary management strategies for the diseases of the gastrointestinal tract. And to start out, we're going to start out in the mouth with something that's very simple, something that we don't think about most days, and that's the chewing of our food. In our mouth, chewing food breaks it up into smaller pieces, and it moistens the food, and it introduces a compound called salivary amylase. And salivary amylase digests carbohydrate. So that means that amylase is a digestive enzyme. Anywhere you see that last three letters of ASE, that's going to tell you it's an enzyme, and an enzyme facilitates something to happen. So in this case, it facilitates the breaking down of carbohydrate. So you can do a little experiment. You can take a piece of bread and hold it in your mouth. Don't chew it, don't swallow it, hold it in your mouth. And the longer it stays in your mouth, the sweeter it gets. It's taking a complex carbohydrate, bread, and breaking it into its smaller component pieces, and the smaller those pieces get, the sweeter they get. Another example where you can see something going awry is in head and neck cancer. In someone who's had head and neck cancer and they've had radiation to the head and neck, what ends up happening is you end up not being able to produce saliva. So what happens is you have to have foods that are moistened. So instead of having an apple, you might want to have applesauce. Instead of having a potato with no gravy or margarine on it, you actually may want to put some gravy or margarine on it to moisten that food. And so, or you can also put in artificial saliva to help to moisten that. So again, most of us don't appreciate what can go wrong until it goes wrong, and then you have to modify what you're going to eat. Well, after you chew your food, we're going to have this series of one-way valves that takes food from the beginning to the end, and the esophagus is where we encounter that first one-way valve. And that first one-way valve is called a cardiac, meaning heart because it's close to the heart, or lower esophageal sphincter. And certainly when this goes wrong, we end up with gastroesophageal reflux disease. And we're going to discuss GERD and more in a future lecture. But when you get to the stomach, that is a very complex, and I'm going to say underappreciated organ, where the process of digestion, how do you digest your food, satiety, that feeling of fullness, continue. So in the stomach, the food is churned and mixed up with digestive juices. Have you ever had the experience of being really hungry and your stomach is grumbling? Well, that's what's happening, is that the stomach is actually churning in the anticipation that hopefully food is on the way. The stomach is also highly acidic, and most of the time we think of that acid in the stomach as a bad thing, where there's real physiological function. But the stomach is so unique, it is protected from its own very acidic contents by what's called a mucin layer. Not mucus, but a mucin layer that lines the stomach. So it's like its own protective insulation in that stomach to prevent it from being auto-digested or digested by itself. So what is the function of this acid? Well, first, it aids in the process of digestion. It helps to take bigger molecules and turn them into smaller pieces. It also kills bacteria. Most of the time, we don't think of bacteria in our GI tract, but literally some estimates suggest that we eat enough bacteria to make over 1,000 people sick every day. But why don't we get sick? Well, part of the reason is bacteria can't live in a really acidic environment. So the next time you decide to live on antacids, what does an antacid do? It goes against acid. It raises the pH of the stomach from something very acidic to something that's basic. That's not always a good thing. That acid in the stomach also helps to activate or make both iron, a mineral, thiamine, a B vitamin, more available to be absorbed. So there are really key functions of that mucin lining protecting the stomach and real functions for that acid in your stomach. Now that mucin lining can be eroded by most notably non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medications. So we all take ibuprofen or we've taken aspirin. Those are examples of non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. So my world where I take care of athletes, when I have an athlete, a male athlete who has anemia, iron deficiency anemia, it's almost always because he's been taking too many anti-inflammatories. It's worn down that mucin lining, broken it down, and when it's broken down, the acid can now attack that very vulnerable muscular lining in the stomach and causes it to bleed. There may be no pain associated with it. You certainly don't see red blood when you go and have a bowel movement, but nonetheless, it is there, and you can end up having some real significant problems with anemia. So what else does the stomach do? The stomach makes a compound called intrinsic factor. An intrinsic factor is secreted by the parietal cells, a very specialized set of cells in the stomach, secreted by the parietal cells, and what it does is it acts as a key to unlock vitamin B12 from food. So without intrinsic factor, you cannot unlock B12 from food, and it causes a type of anemia, oftentimes referred to as pernicious anemia. So having that intrinsic factor, having those parietal cells make intrinsic factor is really pretty key. Now I want you to think for a second, in our world of gastric bypass, when an individual has gastric bypass surgery, and I've now made that stomach reservoir much smaller, what does that do? Well, it makes less acid available for the digestion of food. What else does it do? It makes less intrinsic factor, increases the likelihood of a B12 deficiency, and truly people who have had gastric bypass surgery really have to take vitamin B injections for the rest of their life because they don't have as much intrinsic factor. Certainly the aging process also diminishes the amount of intrinsic factor that is produced. And so there's a type of anemia, pernicious anemia, that can be significant in individuals over the age of 50. So the older we get, part of the normal aging process, if you want to think about it that way, the normal aging process is less intrinsic factor. Less intrinsic factor means less vitamin B12 gets absorbed. And again, data is not conclusive on the percentage of people, but we can say it's a significant number of adults over the age of 50. I also really love the function of the stomach and its role in satiety and fullness. In our stomach, we don't have a calorie sensor. We can't go tick, tick, tick and say, okay, that was a 500 calorie meal. We get no instant feedback. But what we do have in the stomach is what is known as a volume sensor. So we can sense volume, and volume of food makes us feel full. Well, in this day and age of energy bars and foods that have a lot of calories in a small space, there is some thought that what contributes to the obesity epidemic is we eat a lot of foods that don't have much volume. We never trigger these volume receptors in our stomach to say, I'm done, I don't need any more food. And so the challenge for us is, can we create more volume in our meals? And the answer is, sure we can. We have high water volume foods, fruits, vegetables, soup, yogurt, milk, 80 to 90% water on average. And so these high water volume foods stretch our stomach, these stretch receptors are activated, send chemicals to your brain saying, I'm done. So again, think back to your grandma. You always had what was called a well-balanced meal. Lots of fruits and vegetables on the plate. Little did we know at that time that the water in that food helped to trigger that sense of fullness. So here's an example for you. If I gave you 5 large apples, a fruit bowl of apples, and I said, this is your snack this afternoon, you probably would tell me, oh, I can't eat 5 large apples. That's way too much food. Your eye is telling you the volume is too great. You can't possibly eat that volume of food. But if I said to you, I want you to eat a king-size individual bag of M&Ms, still individual, king-size individual bag of M&Ms, you'd probably say, oh, I could eat that, if you're being honest. I can eat that amount of M&Ms. But you couldn't eat 5 large apples. The calories are the same. The calories are the same. The volume is different. So this concept of volume is going to come back over and over when we start talking about weight management, the management of metabolic syndrome and cardiovascular disease. This is going to come back over and over again. Certainly at the end of the stomach, you have what is called a gastric sphincter. It controls the rate of emptying from your stomach to your small intestine. And that's going to be a significant factor when we talk about the small intestine. Now, I do want to give you a heads up that true stomach disorders like gastric ulcers and gastric bypass are going to be covered in more detail in following lectures. But the workhorse of the digestive process, the true workhorse, occurs in the small intestine. In the small intestine, we have a series of digestive enzymes that help to aid in the breakdown of carbohydrate, protein, and fat. So we have this workhorse. So if you were to ask yourself the question, where does most of the digestive process occur? It occurs in the small intestine. Now, certainly certain other organs of the body make their contribution to this process. Bile, for example, made by your liver, stored in the gallbladder, is needed for the emulsification of fat. And to emulsify means that I'm going to take that watery content of the stomach, and now what I need to do is get the fat and the water to mix together. Well, think about this as an example. You've all had Italian salad dressing. And right before you pour it on your salad, what are you doing? You're shaking it up. And when you shake it up, you are making a temporary emulsion. Temporarily, you're mixing that oil and water together. Well, bile's role is to get the watery contents of your stomach and the fat in your meal to mix together so it can be attacked in greater force by these digestive enzymes. So here's a tip for you. Bile is 70% cholesterol. Bile is 70% cholesterol. So what that means is in response to a fatty meal, you make bile. Bile is normally recycled. So we might want to think of our intestinal tract as a green organ. Our gut naturally recycles bile and we don't excrete it. Well, what oatmeal does is the fiber in oatmeal binds to that bile. Instead of the recycling process going on, what ends up happening is that bile is now eliminated when you have a bowel movement. So your body has to make more bile. Where does it get the substrate? Where does it get the building blocks to make bile? If it's 70% cholesterol, what it's doing is removing cholesterol from your blood to make bile, which is needed to emulsify the fat. So when you hear claims for oatmeal lowering your cholesterol, the way it lowers cholesterol is it binds to that bile and causes it to be excreted, where your body now has to make more. So these gummy fibers that you find in oatmeal are certainly going to be a valuable adjunct to the prevention of cardiovascular disease. Now, certainly there are many fiber supplements out there that can be used for the treatment of constipation, and if they're that gumming kind of gelling fiber, can really be used as an adjunct to help to control your cholesterol. So we've got our liver and gallbladder helping us out here in the production and the storage of bile. And now we've got another real workhorse here, and that's the pancreas. The pancreas contributes valuable enzymes as well as hormones. So when we look at it this way, it's got two functions. It's making all these enzymes, lipase, amylase, protease, and that is called its exocrine function. It also has an endocrine function, which means it produces hormones. So the